Morty discovers his fondness for doing nothing gradually, without intention or announcement. It does not arrive as a preference so much as a realization, something that settles into him after enough movement, enough urgency, enough moments where everything demanded his attention at once. At first, doing nothing feels unfamiliar. His mind, trained by constant reaction, struggles against the absence of stimulus. Stillness leaves space, and space invites thoughts he has learned to keep at bay. But over time, he notices something else. When he allows himself to sit without purpose, without distraction, the noise inside him begins to soften. Doing nothing does not mean emptiness. It means relief. Morty's life is defined by response. He reacts to danger, to expectations, to pressure that comes from understanding too much too early. Even when he is not actively on an adventure, some part of him remains alert, braced for interruption. That constant readiness takes a toll he does not immediately recognize. Doing nothing interrupts that cycle. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being needed too often, from being present in situations where presence itself carries weight. Morty feels that exhaustion deeply, even if he lacks the language to name it. Doing nothing offers him a way to exist without contributing, without compensating, without stabilizing anyone else's chaos. In those moments, he is not required to be brave or thoughtful or moral. He is not the voice of hesitation or conscience. He is simply there. At first, he feels guilty about it. The world has taught him that inactivity is wasted time, that usefulness defines value. Rick's influence reinforces this idea constantly. Motion is efficiency. Action is intelligence. Stillness is weakness. Morty absorbs these messages even as they wear him down, but his body tells him something different. When he does nothing, his breathing changes. His muscles loosen. The tension he carries, without realizing, it begins to fade. These shifts are subtle, but they are consistent. They teach him something his mind resists at first. That rest is not a failure of responsibility. It is a requirement for endurance. Morty begins to seek out these moments instinctively. Sitting without engaging. Lying still without distraction. Letting time pass without marking it. These acts are not dramatic. They would look like nothing at all to anyone else. To Morty, they feel essential. Doing nothing gives him permission to stop performing. Much of his life feels like performance, even when it is genuine. He reacts in expected ways. He fills roles assigned to him. He adapts constantly. Doing nothing strips all of that away. It leaves him without expectation. In that absence, he feels closer to himself than he does during moments of intensity. He notices that his thoughts behave differently when he is not occupied. They slow down. They lose their sharp edges. He does not spiral as easily. Memories still surface, but they do so gently, without demanding immediate resolution. Doing nothing gives those memories space to exist without overwhelming him. This becomes especially important because Morty carries guilt differently than others. He does not compartmentalize easily. Consequences linger with him. Regret stays active. Doing nothing does not erase these feelings, but it changes how they move through him. Instead of crashing all at once, they drift, manageable and less intrusive. There is a quiet dignity in that process. Morty also begins to realize that doing nothing is one of the few states where time feels normal again. Adventures distort time until it becomes either urgent or meaningless. Stillness restores its rhythm. Minutes pass slowly. Hours unfold without pressure. Morty finds comfort in that pacing. It reassures him that not everything must be immediate to be real. He does not think of doing nothing as laziness. He thinks of it as recalibration. When he does nothing, he reconnects with sensations that ground him, the feeling of gravity, the texture of fabric, the ambient sounds of life continuing around him. These details anchor him in the present moment, pulling him out of the endless scope of what he knows exists beyond it. Doing nothing becomes a way of narrowing the universe back down to a human scale. Morty learns that his mind is less kind to him when it is constantly occupied. Activity leaves little room for reflection, and without reflection, everything begins to blur. Doing nothing creates separation. It allows experiences to settle, to arrange themselves into something coherent instead of remaining raw. This is not a process he controls consciously. It happens because stillness allows it to. There are moments when he does nothing simply because he cannot do anything else, when he feels too full of experience to take in more. During those times, stillness is not chosen. It is necessary. Morty learns to respect that necessity rather than fight it. He stops forcing himself to be productive when his mind and body are asking for pause. Doing nothing also becomes a quiet act of defiance. In a life shaped by constant escalation, choosing stillness feels almost rebellious. It is a refusal to let intensity dictate value, a reminder that existence does not need to justify itself through action. Morty does not articulate this belief. He lives it. He notices that after periods of doing nothing, he feels more capable of engaging again. Not more eager, but more stable. Less reactive, less brittle. The stillness does not make him stronger in obvious ways. It makes him less likely to break. This is something he comes to trust deeply. Doing nothing gives Morty a place where he is not defined by his role in anyone else's story. He is not a sidekick or a conscience or a burden or a solution. He is simply a person occupying space. That simplicity matters more than he ever expected it to. Over time, he stops explaining these moments to himself. He stops questioning their value. He allows them to exist without justification, just as they allow him to exist without demand. Morty likes doing nothing, because doing nothing asks nothing of him. And in a life where so much is demanded, that absence becomes a form of care. When Morty allows himself to remain still for longer stretches of time, he begins to notice how rare that permission truly is in his life. Even rest, when it is allowed, is usually framed as preparation for what comes next. Sleep exists so you can wake up. Quiet exists so it can be broken. Stillness is tolerated only when it serves motion. Doing nothing refuses that logic. In those moments, Morty is not preparing. He is not recovering in order to be useful again. He is simply existing without direction or expectation. This distinction matters more to him than he can easily explain. It separates rest from obligation. It allows him to feel human rather than functional. He notices how much of his stress comes not from danger, but from anticipation. The sense that something will be asked of him soon. Doing nothing disrupts that anticipation. It creates a pocket of time where nothing is expected, where the future does not need to be managed. At first, this lack of structure makes him uneasy. His thoughts search for tasks, for responsibilities, for something to hold on to. But as he stays with the stillness, that unease fades. His mind adjusts. it learns that it does not need to fill every gap with vigilance. This adjustment feels like relief settling into his bones. Morty begins to recognize that his fear often spikes when he feels trapped in momentum, when events move too quickly for him to process, when decisions pile up faster than he can evaluate them. Doing nothing interrupts that momentum. It slows the pace to something his nervous system can follow. In stillness, he is not behind. He is exactly where he is. This becomes especially important because Morty lives in a world that rarely allows pause. Problems escalate. Stakes increase. Consequences ripple outward. Doing nothing becomes one of the few ways he can step outside that escalation without denying reality. He does not imagine that stillness will protect him from what comes next. He understands too much for that. What it does instead is give him a sense of proportion. It reminds him that not every moment needs to carry weight, that not every second must be optimized for survival. Morty begins to feel more present in his own body during these moments. Without distraction, he becomes aware of subtle sensations he usually ignores: the rise and fall of his breathing, the way his weight settles. These physical cues reassure him that he is here, intact, not in danger right now. That reassurance is powerful. Doing nothing also creates space for gentler thoughts. Not analysis, not problem-solving, but wandering. His mind drifts without urgency. He thinks about small things, unfinished games, half-remembered dreams. These thoughts do not lead anywhere, and that is precisely why they are comforting. They exist without consequence. Morty begins to realize that much of his emotional fatigue comes from consequence, from knowing that his actions matter in ways that cannot always be undone. Doing nothing suspends that burden briefly. In stillness, nothing is decided. Nothing is risked. Nothing is lost. There is peace in that suspension. He also notices that when he allows himself these pauses, he becomes less reactive afterward, less prone to panic or despair. The stillness does not solve his problems, but it changes his relationship to them. They feel less immediate, less overwhelming. This change is subtle, but cumulative. Over time, doing nothing becomes one of the few states where Morty feels unobserved, not watched, not evaluated, not measured against expectations. In a life where he often feels seen only for what he provides, invisibility becomes a relief rather than a threat. He does not want to disappear permanently. He simply wants moments where he does not have to be anything. Doing nothing gives him that. It also teaches him patience with himself. He learns that not every feeling needs to be acted upon immediately. That discomfort can exist without requiring resolution. That uncertainty does not always demand answers. These lessons come quietly, without instruction. Morty starts to trust that stillness will not swallow him, that if he stops moving, he will not vanish. This trust is hard-earned. It comes from repeated proof that rest does not erase identity. It preserves it. Doing nothing becomes a way of staying whole. He does not talk about this. He does not defend it. He simply keeps returning to it whenever he can. These moments may be brief, easily interrupted, but they leave an impression. They recalibrate him just enough to make the next stretch of movement possible. In a universe that equates value with action, Morty learns that rest can be an act of self-preservation. That choosing stillness does not mean giving up. It means refusing to be consumed. He likes doing nothing because, in those moments, he is not running from the universe or chasing it. he is letting it pass by without pulling him along. And for someone who has been pulled through too much, that choice matters. As Morty becomes more comfortable with stillness, he starts to recognize how deeply it contrasts with the rest of his life. Action in his world is rarely optional. Movement is expected. Decisions arrive whether he is ready or not. Doing nothing stands apart from all of that, not as avoidance, but as a space where choice finally belongs to him. In stillness, he chooses not to choose. This choice feels small, but it carries weight. It allows him to reclaim a sense of agency that is often stripped away during moments of crisis. When nothing is happening, nothing is being taken from him. His time, his attention, his emotions remain his own. Morty begins to understand that this ownership is rare. Most of his experiences demand response. Stillness asks for none. It simply allows him to exist without being shaped by external pressure. There are moments when he realizes that doing nothing is the only time he is not adapting. Everywhere else, he adjusts himself to fit circumstances that were never designed with him in mind. He learns new rules, new dangers, new expectations. In stillness, there is nothing to adapt to. He can remain exactly as he is. That constancy feels grounding. He notices that his sense of self feels clearest during these moments, not because he is thinking about who he is, but because nothing is pulling him away from it. Identity, he learns, is easier to feel than to define. Doing nothing lets him feel it. This realization changes how he views his own needs. He stops dismissing his desire for rest as weakness. He begins to see it as information. His body and mind communicating limits that deserve attention. Ignoring those limits has consequences. Stillness prevents those consequences from compounding. Morty also begins to see that doing nothing creates a kind of emotional neutrality. Not numbness, but balance. High-stakes experiences push his emotions to extremes. Fear spikes. Guilt lingers. Stillness allows those emotions to settle back toward center. It does not erase them, but it reduces their intensity. This reduction is not dramatic, but it is noticeable. He finds that he is kinder to himself after periods of rest, less harsh in his self-assessment, less inclined to replay mistakes endlessly. The quiet creates distance between him and his self-criticism. It reminds him that he is more than the sum of his worst moments. Doing nothing becomes a place where forgiveness feels possible. There is also a subtle shift in how he perceives the world during these moments. Without constant engagement, his senses open up rather than shut down. He notices small changes, subtle movements. The passage of time as something gentle instead of threatening. These observations do not overwhelm him. They reassure him. Morty begins to associate stillness with safety, not absolute safety, but relative safety. The kind that exists when nothing immediate is wrong. This association matters. It gives his nervous system a reference point, a memory of calm it can return to even when circumstances change. Over time, he carries that memory with him. Doing nothing does not make Morty detached from life. It makes him more selective about how he participates in it. He learns that constant engagement is not sustainable, that rest is not a pause between meaningful moments. It is part of meaning itself. This understanding softens his fear of the future. He no longer imagines it as an endless escalation of responsibility and intensity. He knows now that he can step out of motion, even briefly, without losing himself. That knowledge makes continuation feel possible. Morty does not need doing nothing to last forever. He understands its temporary nature. That does not diminish its value. If anything, it sharpens it. Each quiet moment feels precious precisely because it is limited. He holds those moments carefully, not clinging, but appreciating. As he grows, doing nothing remains one of the few constants he can rely on. It does not change form. It does not demand reinterpretation. It remains what it has always been, a space where he is allowed to exist without obligation. In a life filled with demands, expectations, and consequences that stretch far beyond his control, that space becomes essential. Morty likes doing nothing because it reminds him that he does not have to earn the right to exist, that being alive is not a task to be completed, that rest is not a reward for endurance, but a condition for it. And in those quiet moments, when nothing is happening and nothing is required, Morty feels something rare. He feels allowed. As Morty continues to grow into this understanding, he begins to sense how unusual it is to feel allowed. The world he moves through rarely grants permission without conditions. Approval is tied to usefulness. Attention is tied to action. Value is measured by contribution. Doing nothing exists outside those systems. In stillness, Morty is not contributing, and yet he remains. This realization settles into him with a quiet certainty. It does not challenge the rules of the universe outright. It simply steps around them. Doing nothing becomes a private space where external logic loses its authority, a place where he does not have to justify his presence. He notices that his mind resists this at first. Years of conditioning tell him that time must be filled, that idleness is dangerous, that if he stops moving, something will catch up to him. But experience teaches him otherwise. Stillness does not invite catastrophe. It invites recovery. Morty begins to trust that invitation. There are moments when he deliberately chooses not to engage, even when something minor demands his attention. Not out of apathy, but out of discernment. He learns to recognize when his energy is better preserved than spent. This is not something he learned through instruction. It emerged naturally, shaped by exhaustion, and reinforced by relief. Doing nothing teaches him to listen inward. He becomes more attuned to the early signs of overload, the subtle tightness in his chest, the way his thoughts start to race, the quiet irritation that builds when he is stretched too thin. When he notices these signals, he withdraws when he can. He returns to stillness before he reaches a breaking point. This is not avoidance. It is maintenance. Morty also notices how different his thoughts feel when he is not occupied. They lose their edge. They soften. Instead of spiraling toward worst-case scenarios, they wander toward neutral or even gentle territory. He remembers things that are not painful. Small, unremarkable moments that never demanded attention, but now resurface without resistance. These memories do not overwhelm him. They comfort him. He begins to understand that his fear often feeds on motion, on escalation, on the sense that something must be decided immediately. Doing nothing starves that fear. It removes urgency from the equation. It allows emotions to exist without being amplified. This change does not make him fearless. It makes fear manageable. Morty also finds that stillness helps him reconnect with his body in ways activity does not. Movement often serves a purpose. Stillness has none. Without purpose, sensation becomes the focus. He notices how his body feels when it is not bracing for impact. This awareness reassures him that not every moment carries danger. Over time, this reassurance becomes familiar. Doing nothing also gives Morty a sense of internal boundaries. When he is constantly active, everything blends together. Experiences overlap. Emotions bleed into one another. Stillness creates separation. It allows moments to end. It gives him a sense of closure that action rarely provides. This closure helps him process without force. He begins to trust that not everything needs to be resolved immediately, that some experiences can be set down gently and revisited later, or not at all. Doing nothing provides the space where that setting down can occur. Morty realizes that stillness is one of the few places where he feels unburdened by consequence. Nothing he does here will ripple outward. Nothing will alter trajectories or timelines. The absence of impact becomes a relief rather than a disappointment. He does not need every moment to matter on a cosmic scale. This understanding reshapes his relationship with significance. He no longer feels compelled to assign meaning to everything he experiences. Some moments can exist without purpose and still be worthwhile. Doing nothing teaches him that value does not require justification. This lesson stays with him as he moves forward. In a universe that constantly demands engagement, Morty learns the quiet power of disengagement, not as withdrawal from life, but as a way of sustaining it. Stillness becomes his way of remaining present without being overwhelmed. He likes doing nothing because it gives him a version of himself that is not shaped by crisis, a self that exists outside of urgency and expectation, a self that does not need to be explained. And in those moments, when nothing is happening and no one is asking anything of him, Morty feels something close to peace, not because the world has stopped being dangerous, but because, for once, he has stopped being demanded. Over time, Morty begins to notice that doing nothing changes the way he remembers things. Experiences that once felt sharp and overwhelming soften around the edges when they are given space to settle. Without constant stimulation, his memories rearrange themselves, no longer stacked in a single suffocating mass. Stillness allows them to separate, to take on individual shapes instead of blending into one continuous sense of strain. This shift matters more than he realizes at first. When Morty is always moving, always reacting, memory feels like something chasing him. Images surface uninvited. Emotions attach themselves without warning. Doing nothing slows that pursuit. It gives memory a place to arrive without urgency. In the quiet, recollection becomes less intrusive, more observational. He is no longer reliving everything at once. Morty begins to understand that stillness offers him control over proximity. He cannot erase what he has seen, but he can decide how close it sits to the surface. Doing nothing creates distance without denial. It allows him to acknowledge experience without being swallowed by it. This distance becomes one of his most valuable internal tools. He also notices that his sense of self feels more continuous during long stretches of inactivity. When he is not constantly responding to external demands, his internal narrative becomes clearer. He remembers what he likes, what he dislikes, what calms him, what unsettles him. These preferences do not announce themselves during crisis. They require quiet to be heard. Doing nothing gives them that space. Morty begins to reconnect with parts of himself that had been overshadowed by urgency. His curiosity, when it is not driven by fear. His imagination, when it is not occupied with survival, his emotions when they are not pulled toward extremes. These aspects do not disappear during chaos, but they are drowned out. Stillness allows them to resurface. This reconnection feels stabilizing. He realizes that much of what frightens him about the future is the idea of endless demand, a life where every moment requires response, decision, sacrifice. Doing nothing interrupts that narrative. It shows him that time can exist without pressure, that days can pass without being consumed by necessity. This possibility changes how he imagines adulthood. Morty no longer sees growing up as a process of becoming constantly occupied. He begins to imagine a future where rest is integrated rather than postponed, where stillness is not something earned after exhaustion, but something woven into life itself. This vision does not feel unrealistic. It feels reasonable. He also begins to notice how differently he treats others when he is well rested. When he has allowed himself periods of doing nothing, he is more patient, less reactive, more capable of listening without immediately responding. Stillness does not isolate him. It makes connection easier by reducing internal noise. Morty does not consciously attribute this change to rest. He simply notices that interactions feel less strained, that he is less likely to feel overwhelmed by proximity. This reinforces his instinct to return to stillness whenever possible. Doing nothing becomes a form of emotional hygiene. He starts to recognize how often intensity is mistaken for importance. Loud experiences dominate attention, while quiet ones are dismissed. Stillness challenges that hierarchy. It demonstrates that significance does not always announce itself through urgency or volume. Morty begins to trust what feels calm rather than what feels dramatic. There are moments when he worries that liking stillness means he is giving up, that by choosing rest he is opting out of engagement. These doubts surface occasionally, shaped by the expectations placed on him by a world that rewards constant action. But experience counters them. After doing nothing, he does not feel diminished. He feels restored. This restoration becomes undeniable. He understands now that stillness does not remove responsibility. It preserves his capacity to carry it. Without rest, responsibility becomes crushing. With it, responsibility becomes manageable. Doing nothing ensures that when he must act, he can do so without being fractured. Morty does not idolize stillness. He knows it cannot last indefinitely. Life will intrude. Demands will return. But he no longer fears that intrusion as he once did. He trusts his ability to step back into quiet when needed. This trust reduces his sense of entrapment. He begins to see stillness as something he can carry internally, even when external circumstances do not allow it fully. A way of slowing his breath, a way of narrowing his focus, a way of creating a small pocket of calm within himself. Doing nothing teaches him that calm is not only situational, it can be cultivated. This understanding stays with him, shaping how he navigates the world. It informs the way he handles stress, the way he recovers from fear, the way he imagines his own endurance. Morty likes doing nothing because it reminds him that he is not only a participant in chaos, he is also someone who can step outside it, even briefly, without losing relevance or worth. In a life defined by movement and consequence, stillness becomes his quiet anchor. And as long as he knows how to return to it, Morty believes he can keep going without losing himself to the noise that surrounds him. As this understanding settles more deeply, Morty begins to notice that doing nothing also changes the way he relates to pressure. Pressure no longer feels like a constant presence, pressing down on him from every direction. It becomes something that rises and falls, something he can step away from, rather than something he must always endure. Stillness gives him contrast. Without it, everything feels equally urgent. With it, urgency becomes visible for what it is, temporary. Morty starts to recognize that many demands feel overwhelming, not because they are impossible, but because they arrive without pause. Doing nothing inserts that pause. It breaks the illusion that everything must be addressed immediately. This realization does not make problems disappear, but it reshapes how he approaches them. He begins to wait before reacting, not out of avoidance, but out of self-preservation. That waiting often reveals that some problems resolve themselves or at least lose their sharpest edges. Doing nothing teaches him that not all tension requires intervention. This lesson stays with him. There are moments when Morty feels the pull to fill silence, to distract himself, to stay busy simply because stillness feels unfamiliar. When that urge arises, he notices it instead of obeying it. He allows the discomfort to pass. Over time, that discomfort loses its power. Stillness becomes less threatening, more familiar. He learns that boredom is not dangerous. It is simply empty space waiting to be inhabited. Doing nothing also changes how he experiences his own thoughts. When his mind is constantly occupied, thoughts feel intrusive, relentless. In stillness, they slow. They lose urgency. He can observe them without being swept along. This distance gives him a sense of control he rarely feels elsewhere. Morty begins to trust his inner world more because of this. He realizes that his thoughts are not enemies. They become overwhelming only when he never allows them space to settle. Doing nothing gives them that space. He also notices that stillness helps him recover from emotional overload more effectively than distraction ever did. Distraction delays processing. Stillness allows it. It gives his emotions room to move through him without getting stuck. This movement feels natural rather than forced. Morty starts to understand that his sensitivity is not a flaw. It is simply something that requires care. Doing nothing provides that care. It gives his nervous system a break from constant stimulation. It allows him to remain open without becoming raw. This understanding shifts how he treats himself. He becomes gentler with his limits. He stops pushing through exhaustion just to prove he can. He recognizes that endurance is not about ignoring limits, but about respecting them. Doing nothing becomes a way of honoring what his body and mind are asking for. There is quiet confidence in this shift. Morty also notices how rarely he is truly alone in stillness. Even when no one is actively present, there is a sense of shared existence. Life continues around him. The world does not disappear when he stops engaging with it. This realization reassures him that stepping back does not mean being left behind. The universe does not require his constant attention to keep turning. This understanding eases his fear of irrelevance. He does not need to constantly assert his presence to matter. He can exist quietly and still belong to the world. Doing nothing reinforces this truth again and again. Over time, Morty begins to rely on stillness as a way of recalibrating his sense of scale. When the universe feels too large, he shrinks his focus. When his thoughts race too far ahead, he brings them back to the present moment. Doing nothing becomes the simplest way to do this. He does not need tools or techniques. He simply stops. This simplicity is what makes it effective. Morty carries this habit forward, even as his life continues to demand more of him. Stillness becomes something he returns to instinctively, like a place he knows well. It does not fix everything, but it keeps him from being overwhelmed by everything. He likes doing nothing because it reminds him that his worth is not tied to motion, achievement, or reaction. It exists independently, quietly, without needing proof. And in a life where so much feels conditional, that unconditional existence becomes something precious. As Morty grows more comfortable with that unconditional space, he begins to notice how rare it is to encounter anything that does not ask for something in return. Most of his experiences are transactional in subtle ways. Attention demands response. Help demands sacrifice. Even affection often arrives with expectation attached. Doing nothing exists outside of that economy. It asks nothing. It costs nothing. It gives him room. Morty starts to understand that stillness is one of the few places where he is not being evaluated. Not by others. Not by himself. There are no standards to meet, no outcomes to measure. Without performance, there is no failure. That absence of judgment allows him to rest in a way he rarely does elsewhere. This rest is not dramatic. It is not cathartic. It is quiet and steady, like pressure slowly releasing from something that has been held too tightly for too long. He notices how differently his body responds when it is not anticipating demand. His posture softens. His breathing deepens. These changes happen without effort. They feel automatic, as if his body has been waiting for permission to relax. Doing nothing gives that permission. Morty begins to recognize that many of his anxieties are fueled by the belief that he must always be ready. Ready to respond. Ready to adapt. Ready to endure. Stillness interrupts that belief. It shows him that readiness does not have to be constant to be effective. He learns that he can be unready and still be okay. This realization reduces the pressure he places on himself. He stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios quite as often. He allows uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to solve it. Doing nothing becomes a way of sitting with not knowing, without panic. There is strength in that tolerance. Morty also begins to notice how stillness changes his sense of connection to the present. Without distraction, moments feel fuller. Not more intense, but more complete. He is aware of where he is without needing to analyze it. Presence stops being a concept and becomes a sensation. This presence feels grounding in a way nothing else does. He realizes that much of his fear comes from being mentally elsewhere, in futures that have not happened yet, in memories that refuse to stay put. Doing nothing gently brings him back to now, to the moment that is actually unfolding, rather than the ones that might or might not follow. That return to the present does not solve his problems. It makes them less abstract, less overwhelming. Morty starts to see that stillness does not isolate him from reality. It anchors him within it. It allows him to experience life as it is, rather than as a constant projection of what could go wrong. This shift is subtle, but transformative. He also becomes more comfortable with silence, both external and internal. Silence no longer feels like a void that must be filled. It feels like space that can be inhabited. Doing nothing teaches him that silence can be supportive rather than threatening. He carries that comfort into other parts of his life. He becomes less reactive in quiet moments with others. less inclined to rush in with words or actions. This changes the quality of his interactions. They feel calmer, more grounded. Morty does not consciously attribute this change to stillness. He simply notices that things feel less strained. Doing nothing also helps him reconcile with the idea that not every moment needs to be meaningful. That significance can emerge naturally, rather than being forced. This understanding reduces his need to justify his existence through productivity or impact. He learns that being is enough. This lesson does not come easily. It is reinforced slowly through repetition. Each time he allows himself to remain still without consequence, the belief strengthens. Over time, it becomes something he trusts. Morty begins to see stillness as a form of internal alignment, a way of bringing his thoughts, emotions, and body into agreement. When those elements are aligned, everything feels more manageable. He feels less fragmented. This alignment becomes one of the most valuable things he carries forward. He does not protect it aggressively. He knows it will be interrupted. Life ensures that. But he also knows how to return to it. He trusts that he can find stillness again, even after long stretches without it. That trust makes the future feel less oppressive. Morty likes doing nothing because it reminds him that life does not have to be justified through action. That rest is not something to apologize for. That existence can be quiet and still valid. In a universe that constantly demands motion, Morty learns the quiet courage of staying still. And that courage, unremarkable as it appears from the outside, becomes one of the ways he survives without losing himself. With each return to stillness, Morty grows more familiar with the version of himself that exists there. This version does not rush. It does not anticipate. It does not brace for impact. It simply exists in the present, unguarded, but not unaware. Morty begins to trust this version of himself in a way he rarely trusts the one shaped by constant reaction. He realizes that doing nothing does not make him passive. It makes him observant. In stillness, he notices how much of his fear comes from movement rather than circumstance. The faster things happen, the harder it is to feel grounded. The quieter everything becomes, the more manageable reality feels. This awareness does not make him seek isolation. It makes him value balance. Morty starts to recognize that stillness is where his intuition speaks most clearly. Not the sharp instincts that trigger during danger, but the quieter signals that guide him toward what feels right or wrong. When he is constantly active, those signals are drowned out. Doing nothing allows them to surface. This realization gives him a subtle sense of internal guidance. He no longer feels entirely dependent on external direction. He learns that he has an internal rhythm that can be followed if given the chance. Doing nothing creates that chance. It gives him time to hear himself think without interference. Morty also notices that stillness changes the way he carries stress. Stress no longer accumulates endlessly. It finds release. It dissipates gradually rather than compounding. Doing nothing prevents stress from becoming a permanent state. This relief does not announce itself. It reveals itself in absence. Less tension, less irritability, less emotional volatility. These changes are quiet but significant. He begins to see that stillness is one of the few states where he is not trying to manage outcomes. He is not planning ahead or revisiting the past. He is not measuring his actions against potential consequences. This suspension of management feels liberating. For once, nothing is at stake. Morty understands how rare that feeling is. In his life, almost everything carries risk. Even small choices can spiral outward. Doing nothing creates a pocket of existence where consequence is minimal, where his presence does not alter the trajectory of anything beyond himself. That minimal impact feels like relief rather than insignificance. He begins to recognize that his fear of growing up is tied, in part, to the idea that life will demand constant engagement, that adulthood will erase spaces where nothing is required. Doing nothing challenges that assumption. It shows him that rest can exist alongside responsibility. This realization softens his anxiety about the future. Morty starts to imagine a life where stillness is not stolen moments between crises, but an integrated part of daily existence. This vision does not feel extravagant. It feels sustainable. It gives him something to move toward that does not involve escalation. He does not cling to this idea. He allows it to exist quietly, like a possibility rather than a plan. Stillness also helps Morty process his sense of identity more gently. Without external roles to perform, he is not forced to define himself. He can simply experience being himself. This experiential understanding feels more authentic than any label or explanation. He learns that identity does not require constant reinforcement. It persists even when unobserved. Doing nothing becomes a place where Morty feels least fragmented, where his thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations align without effort. This alignment feels rare and precious. It reminds him that coherence is possible, even after everything he has seen. He does not seek to maintain this state indefinitely. He knows it will pass. What matters is that it exists at all. Morty carries the memory of stillness with him as he returns to movement. It informs how he engages, how he reacts, how he recovers. The quiet does not disappear when he leaves it behind. It lingers, influencing him in subtle ways. This influence becomes part of his resilience. He no longer measures strength by endurance alone. He measures it by his ability to step back, to rest, to recalibrate without shame. Doing nothing teaches him that sustainability matters more than intensity. This lesson stays with him. In a universe defined by extremes, Morty learns the value of moderation, of pacing, of choosing when to engage and when to pause. Doing nothing becomes one of the ways he protects himself from being consumed by excess. He likes doing nothing because it gives him a version of life that does not ask him to be extraordinary. A life that allows him to exist without pressure, without performance, without consequence. And in that quiet allowance, Morty finds something rare. He finds himself. As Morty becomes more familiar with himself in stillness, he begins to notice how much of his identity has been shaped by reaction rather than choice. So much of who he is in motion exists because circumstances demand it. Courage appears because fear is present. Responsibility surfaces because chaos leaves no room for hesitation. These traits are real, but they are conditional. Doing nothing reveals what remains when conditions are removed. In that quiet space, Morty is not responding to danger or expectation. He is not compensating for anyone else's recklessness. He is not absorbing consequences meant for someone older, someone more prepared. He is simply present. And that presence feels honest in a way that surprises him. He realizes that stillness strips away performance. Without pressure, there is no role to fill, no version of himself to maintain. This absence does not feel empty. It feels accurate, like seeing himself without distortion. Morty begins to trust this version of himself more than the one forged in crisis, not because it is stronger, but because it is consistent. It does not fluctuate with circumstances. It remains the same whether the universe is quiet or screaming. That consistency becomes important. He starts to understand that doing nothing is one of the few states where he is not being shaped by trauma. Action often reinforces patterns learned under stress. Stillness interrupts those patterns. It allows new ones to form, slower and gentler, built on presence rather than survival. This interruption feels restorative. Morty also notices that when he gives himself permission to do nothing, his creativity changes. It becomes less frantic, less driven by anxiety. Thoughts drift rather than race. Ideas emerge without urgency. He does not feel compelled to act on them immediately. They can exist without obligation. This unpressured creativity feels safe. He realizes that much of his exhaustion comes from constantly needing to translate experience into action. What happened? What must be done? What it means? Doing nothing suspends that translation. It allows experience to exist without interpretation. That suspension is a relief. Morty begins to appreciate how rare it is to have moments that do not ask to be processed. In his life, everything tends to demand understanding. Consequences must be evaluated, outcomes anticipated. Stillness removes that demand. It lets him exist without analysis. He does not underestimate the value of this. He feels it in the way his thoughts loosen their grip, in the way his body stops bracing for impact, in the way his emotions soften without disappearing. Doing nothing becomes a quiet form of integration. He starts to notice that when he neglects stillness for too long, everything feels sharper. Sounds irritate him. Decisions feel heavier. Fear returns more quickly. These changes remind him that rest is not optional. It is part of how he stays intact. Morty does not resent this need. He accepts it. He understands now that sensitivity requires care. That awareness, once expanded, must be balanced by grounding. Doing nothing provides that balance. It gives him a place where awareness does not overwhelm. This balance becomes one of the ways he resists becoming hardened. He has seen what happens when people stop allowing themselves to pause, when motion replaces reflection, when brilliance outruns empathy. Morty does not want that future for himself. Stillness becomes one of the ways he steers away from it, quietly and deliberately. He does not frame this as a choice between action and inaction. He understands that both are necessary. What he learns is how to alternate between them without losing himself in either. Doing nothing teaches him when to stop. This knowledge carries forward into his sense of adulthood. Growing up no longer looks like constant competence or emotional detachment. It looks like balance, like knowing when to engage and when to rest, like understanding that endurance depends on recovery. Morty begins to believe that a life that allows for stillness is not a lesser life. It is a sustainable one. He does not know if he will always be able to protect these moments. He knows they will be interrupted. He knows chaos will return. But he also knows something else now. He knows how to come back to himself. Doing nothing gives him that ability. It anchors him in a version of himself that exists beyond crisis, beyond expectation, beyond consequence. A version that does not need to prove its worth. And for someone who has spent so much time reacting to forces far larger than himself, that quiet certainty matters. Morty likes doing nothing, because it is the one place where he is not being shaped by the universe. He is simply being. As this certainty settles, Morty begins to realize that doing nothing is not an escape from reality. It is a way of meeting reality on terms that do not overwhelm him. When he stops moving, the world does not disappear. It continues quietly around him, unchanged by his pause. That constancy reassures him. It tells him that his absence from action does not cause collapse. The universe does not fall apart when he rests. This realization eases a fear he has carried for a long time. The fear that if he stops paying attention, something terrible will happen, that his vigilance is the only thing holding chaos at bay. Doing nothing challenges that belief gently, without argument. Each quiet moment becomes proof that not everything depends on him. Morty begins to feel lighter because of this. Not unburdened, but less tightly wound. He no longer carries the sense that responsibility is infinite. Stillness teaches him that responsibility has edges, that it can be set down temporarily without being abandoned. He notices how this changes his relationship with guilt. Guilt often demands action. It insists that something must be done immediately to compensate, to fix, to atone. Doing nothing refuses that demand. It allows guilt to exist without feeding it. Over time, this reduces its intensity. Morty learns that not every feeling needs to be answered. This lesson becomes especially important because Morty feels deeply. His emotions do not fade quickly. They linger, overlap, resurface unexpectedly. Without stillness, they pile up. Doing nothing gives them space to settle naturally, without force or suppression. He begins to trust that emotions will move through him if he allows them time. There is also a subtle shift in how he perceives effort. Action once felt like the default state of existence. Stillness felt like an exception. Over time, this balance reverses. Morty begins to see stillness as foundational, and action as something that emerges from it. Rest becomes the baseline rather than the reward. This change feels radical, even if he never frames it that way. He notices that when action arises from stillness, it feels more intentional, less frantic, less driven by panic or obligation. He is able to engage with the world without losing his sense of center. Doing nothing becomes the place where he regains that center. Morty starts to recognize that the world often confuses urgency with importance. Loud problems demand attention, while quiet needs are ignored. Stillness helps him resist that distortion. It teaches him to listen for what is subtle, rather than what is overwhelming. This listening becomes one of his strengths. He carries it with him into situations that do require action. He is less reactive, more deliberate. He does not rush to fill silence or solve every problem immediately. He allows situations to unfold before intervening. This patience changes the outcomes in small but meaningful ways. Morty does not become detached or indifferent. He becomes measured. He also notices that stillness makes joy easier to feel. Not intense joy, but gentle satisfaction. Contentment. The kind that exists without fanfare. When his mind is not constantly bracing for threat, small pleasures register more clearly. They do not compete with fear for attention. Doing nothing creates room for that awareness. Morty begins to understand that his capacity for joy depends on his capacity for rest. Without stillness, joy feels fragile and fleeting. With it, joy becomes more stable, less easily overshadowed by anxiety. This realization gives him hope, even if he never names it. He stops seeing stillness as something he has to steal from the world. He begins to see it as something he can claim, quietly and without apology. This claim does not require permission. It exists because he exists. Morty does not announce this shift. He simply lives it. As he continues forward, stillness remains one of the few constants he can rely on. It does not solve his problems or protect him from what lies ahead. What it does is give him a way to remain intact as he moves through uncertainty. He knows now that doing nothing is not the absence of life. It is part of life's rhythm, a necessary counterbalance to movement and demand, a space where identity can settle and recover. Morty likes doing nothing because it reminds him that he does not have to be constantly engaged with the universe to belong to it, that he can step back without disappearing, that his worth is not measured by motion. And in that understanding, he finds something steady enough to stand on, even when everything else moves. As Morty settles more fully into this rhythm, he begins to notice how stillness reshapes his sense of urgency. Urgency used to feel constant, like a background noise that never shut off. Even when nothing was happening, he felt as though something should be happening. Doing nothing quiets that expectation. It teaches him that urgency is often learned, not inherent. In stillness, nothing is chasing him. This absence of pursuit changes how his mind behaves. Thoughts no longer rush toward conclusions. They linger, drift, sometimes fade entirely. Morty realizes that many of his fears rely on momentum to survive. When momentum slows, fear loses its grip. Doing nothing starves it gently, without confrontation. He does not need to defeat fear. He only needs to outweight it. Morty begins to understand that rest is not passive. It is active in a quieter way. It repairs connections inside him that constant action erodes. It restores his ability to feel without being overwhelmed, to think without spiraling, to exist without bracing. This restoration is cumulative. Each moment of stillness adds something back to him that he did not realize he had lost. A little patience, a little softness, a little trust in his own capacity to endure. These qualities do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves over time, through absence rather than presence. He notices it when things go wrong, and he does not collapse immediately. When disappointment arrives, and he does not spiral. When fear appears and he can hold it without letting it define him. These changes feel subtle, but they are profound. Doing nothing has given him margin. Morty begins to see how much of his earlier exhaustion came from living without margin. Every moment packed, every thought crowded, every emotion layered on top of another. Stillness creates space between things. That space becomes breathable. He learns that life does not have to be dense to be meaningful. This realization affects how he relates to expectations placed on him. He no longer feels obligated to fill every silence with reassurance or every gap with effort. He allows others' discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. This does not make him cold. It makes him less self-erasing. Doing nothing teaches him that he does not need to disappear for others to feel comfortable. He also begins to notice how often he was confusing responsibility with self-sacrifice. Stillness helps him separate the two. Responsibility can exist without constant depletion. Care does not have to mean exhaustion. Doing nothing becomes one of the ways he preserves his ability to care at all. This understanding shifts his internal compass. Morty starts to recognize that the version of adulthood he fears most is one without rest, one where motion never slows and feeling becomes inconvenient. Stillness offers him an alternative model, a future where awareness and softness can coexist with strength. This alternative feels possible now. He does not imagine it as perfect. He knows there will be moments when stillness is unavailable, when life demands everything he has. But he also knows that those moments will pass, that motion does not erase his ability to return. This knowledge makes endurance feel less punishing. Morty carries stillness with him as a quiet constant. It does not protect him from the universe, but it protects his relationship to it. It keeps him from becoming defined solely by reaction. It reminds him that he exists beyond crisis. He begins to trust that this internal refuge will remain available to him, even as he changes, even as he grows older, even as responsibilities increase. Doing nothing becomes less about escape and more about continuity. It is how he stays himself. Morty likes doing nothing because it gives him something the universe rarely offers willingly. A pause, a boundary, a space where he is not required to be anything other than present. And in a life shaped by constant demand, that presence becomes a form of quiet strength, one that does not announce itself, one that does not seek recognition, one that simply endures.